This is part of a series. My name is Brian Feely. I am the Senior Vice President of Marketing for Corporate Synergies. And we've been doing live briefings with Dan Cooperstein for the most part. It feels like we're over a year now with the number of briefings that we've done. We've had a number of different special guests, and with us today is Travis Turner. He is our account manager for our Senior Vice President of Account Management here in the Philadelphia region, and obviously works with many of our clients as it relates to all of these things that we're talking about. But we've been talking, gentlemen, about the CAA for quite some time. And it feels like, every now and then we get a little bit more guidance on it. But, we're going to talk about three specific areas today for the most part. We're talking about the gag clause reporting requirement that just came out. Some guidance on that just literally was released. We're also going to touch base on the RX reporting requirement that happened in the end of 2022. And we can always spend time on the service provider fee disclosure rules, which we have covered in the past a little bit. But again, it's a great reminder for everybody to kind of go through those requirements that are part of that. So in the chat area, we're going to put a link eventually in our chat that you can go to and take a look at the live briefings that we've done for the CAA. Those briefings are on demand, but this will give you a link not only to that, but you can look in our Knowledge Center at the more specific e-alert guidance that Dan and his team have put out. So why don't we start with kind of a brief overview of where we are, Dan? That's how we always start these things, but give us a bit of a sense of where we are, and then we're going to go into each one of those specific areas.
Great. So I know you mentioned we've talked about some of these things before, right? The CAA, the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2021, had a lot of different new transparency and disclosure requirements, as well as new fiduciary obligations on employers and plan sponsors. And so in the past, some of those things we talked about over the last couple of years are the mental health parity, NQTL comparative analysis disclosure, MRF disclosures, the price estimator tool, NSA, the No Surprises Act, surprise billing transparency and disclosure requirements. All of those things are really important parts and components of the CAA. But really, we wanted to kind of really focus in on these three, because these three today really represent some things that we haven't covered yet in past compliance briefings, and they're all topics that are really, I would say, top of mind for many of our clients right now.
And the gag clause doesn't mean that my wife gets to shut me up, right? It's a completely different animal altogether. So perhaps you could start with that one. Let's go over the gag clause reporting, so everybody is caught up to speed on what the requirement is there.
Right, and so you mentioned that this was a new development in the sense that, at the end of last month, at the end of February, we got new guidance about gag clause reporting requirements. But prior to that, there was language in the CAA that said that group health plans and insurers cannot enter into any agreement with a provider, network of providers, TPA, or others who offer access to a network of providers if it would preclude the plan or the insurer from disclosing provider-specific cost or quality of care information or data, or electronically accessing de-identified claims information, and sharing this information with a business associate. So there's all this quality of care and claims information and provider-specific information that prior to CAA was prohibited in these gag clauses. Okay, and when the CAA came out at the end of 2020, it said, look, you can't do this anymore. You can't have these in there. But they didn't really tell us what we need to do. So as of February 23rd, the end of last month, the DOL, HHS, and Treasury, the agencies that are enforcing and implementing the CAA, they came out with new FAQ guidance that said, now we're going to make sure that you do this, because we are going to put in this new gag clause reporting requirement, which is an attestation. It's a new gag clause prohibition compliance attestation, say that 5 times fast, or GCPCA. And this new attestation form, right, has to be submitted by December 31st each year. So the first requirement will be due December 31st, 2023, where you're going to have to attest on this form that there's no gag clauses in your agreement. So I think, before we kind of go into, other stuff, I think it's kind of good to get some examples of, how does this typically come up, right? What does a gag clause look like? And I think, there's two really good examples that I found that are in the guidance that came out at the end of last month. One of them is if a contract, if there's a contract between a TPA and a group health plan that states that the plan will pay providers at rates designated as point of service rates, but the TPA considers those rates to be proprietary, and therefore includes language in the contract saying that the plan cannot disclose the rates to participants or beneficiaries. That's an obvious prohibited gag clause under this. Another great example that was in the guidance says that if there's a contract between a TPA and a plan that provides that the plan sponsors access to provider-specific cost and quality of care information is only at the discretion of the TPA, that would be another one that would definitely be considered a prohibited gag clause. And so really, right, these are the types of things that come up quite often in this business is, they'll say that information is proprietary, that we can release that at our discretion. And now as a result of this rule, not only are you no longer allowed to have these gag clauses, but you have to attest to that fact every year at the end of the year. And I will just briefly mention before we kind of move on, there was an exception in the guidance that says, however, a healthcare provider, network, association of providers, or other service provider may place reasonable restrictions on the public disclosure of this information. But then the FAQs just kind of leave it there. They don't really tell us what those reasonable restrictions are, and they don't give any examples of that. And so I think that, the way I'm reading it, I think as a result of that is that this is a very big prohibition, right? A big prohibition on gag clauses with a very small exception, which is really still remains undefined. And as a result, it's really kind of up to, our clients and, and us working with our clients to really try to, find those gag clauses and make sure that they're removed, and that we get that information, disclosed.
So that's your opinion. That's how you were articulating it.
Yep.
I'm curious. Maybe Travis, why don't you tell us a little bit about how is the industry reacting to this? Now I know it's been only a few weeks here that we're talking about, but do you have any sense for how the industry is responding to this, and is it getting better? Do you have any examples, perhaps? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, the update that just came through last month is so new that when we talked to the carriers, they acknowledged it. They knew that it's out there, but they didn't have a formal response to it yet. It was just too short of a time frame for them really to come back and say, here's how we're going to handle this attestation piece of it, which is one portion of it. So really, when we think about this, it's something to kind of keep in the back of our minds, keep in the back burner. As Dan mentioned, we have through the remainder of the calendar year before these attestations have to be completed and be done. So we're expecting that over the course of the year, we're going to get updates from the carriers and even from TPAs and administrators on how they're going to handle that attestation piece. And we're also, very hopeful that it will be addressed like certain other elements of reporting that are out there, which is when you're fully insured, the fully insured carrier is going to take care of that attestation, and you don't have to do much other than just understand that it's happening, and make sure you have a good understanding about who's filing it, when they're filing it. When we talk about self-funding and we're talking about administrators, we're also hoping that a good portion of that heavy lifting is going to be done by them, but you might have to be a little bit more involved when you're self-funded just to make sure that those attestations are being done timely and you know what the process is. So there's going to be more to come on that particular piece. But I think another really important part of it is something that Dan mentioned earlier, which is, this particular topic with gag clauses has been around for a couple years, but we look at it and we haven't seen a ton of change within the industry, meaning that, carriers very quickly responded to it from a legal standpoint. They updated their contracts and they really kind of did it behind the scenes. and made sure that they were checking all of the boxes that they need to from a legal perspective, but it wasn't something that was really touted or talked about a ton. Now, granted, some of this happened in 2020. There were a few other headlines going on at that time, so it didn't exactly catch the top of a lot of lists, but it happened, and most of it was done within the contracts itself. But what the legislation does, and I think Dan kind of insinuated this before, is that it starts to give us an opportunity and really a leg to stand on to start to push what is released and delivered by the carriers, and even TPAs when you're talking about self-funded, because there are standards and norms and reporting packages, and many of us that are involved in managing these programs, they see all of that. And those reporting packages and those standards didn't really change immediately when the gag clause provision went in. And it's really sort of incumbent upon us to start to push on that and start to ask for it. And in many instances, we don't necessarily know exactly where we're going to push or how it might fall from a contractual standpoint until we start to talk to a carrier or an administrator and they start to put a barrier up. This legislation actually gives us a little bit more that we can work with and a little bit more that we can start to push on to be able to get access to more data when it's appropriate, helpful, and applicable to whatever it is that we're trying to do in the project that we're working on. So we do think that with some pushing over time, we might see some of those industry standards and industry norms maybe shift a little bit with a bit more transparency and a bit more access, which I think ultimately could be a positive thing. But we're in the very nascent stages of all of that.
So if you were to look at this right now, I mean, any of the carriers that would be providing something at this point would be hiding behind the reasonable restrictions, right? So this gives us an opportunity. If this were poker, we're starting to place our bets and call them on it and say, okay, what are your reasonable restrictions? Right? Exactly. Because we have to comply. But so if you're not going to provide it, it must be a reasonable restriction. What is that? Okay, now that we got it, is that something that starts to be compiled in a way that, okay, government, here you go. This is what they're hiding behind. If you want to take action on that and provide even further clarification or guidance, take action on these things because we're on the hook to provide for it by the end of the year. And should they or should they not be hiding behind this? Because there is no clarification as far as I'm hearing, right?
Exactly. So this is really the opportunity for all you, right? For all of our clients to really get that data, right? For you to kind of push back a little bit, use us, right? Use your advocates, your broker consultants to really try to get as much of that data as you can at this point.
And do you think, Dan, that they start looking at each other, the different carriers will be looking at each other because everybody waits for one, okay, what's your position? And then they maybe fall in line. It could be somewhat the opposite too. If you see a carrier beginning to become fully transparent, now they're the carrier of transparency. It's going to be interesting to see if anybody takes ownership of that particular approach and says, you know what, why wait for the government to continue to chip away at this and chip away and require us to do it? Let's go all in now and say that we're the ones that are fully transparent. It kind of reminds us years ago, the way Corporate Synergies did it with being fully transparent with BCSA. I think it's a good thing, but we'll see how it all goes. Right. Why don't we move over to the next area, the RX reporting requirements. And so, Dan, why don't you catch us up on that particular area?
Sure. So this was another big piece of the CAA that requires that group health plan sponsors, both fully insured plans, self-insured plans, are required to annually submit prescription drug and healthcare spending reports to the DOL, HHS, and IRS. Initially, it was required by December 27th of 2022, and then by June 1 each year for what's called the reference year. So in other words, for that first requirement on December 27th of 2022, you were supposed to be reporting on what they call the reference years, which were calendar years 2020 and 2021, and then for the June 1st deadline each year, it'll be so for example, for 2022, you'd be reporting on 2022 in June 1st of 2023. And many of the carriers have reached out already to our clients saying they'd like to get all of those reports and the data together by the end of this month. So by the end of March for that June 1 deadline. So it is something that's very top of mind. Now, what happened here was, just to kind of give everybody an update in case you haven't been reading our e-alerts, what happened was in December, the agencies came out and said, actually, for that first deadline, we're going to give people some extra time. We'll give you a grace period. You don't have to submit those till you didn't have to submit them until January 31 of 2023. So they gave everybody a little bit of a grace period. And now, of course, we have to do it, coming up very soon. And so there's been a lot of questions on this. I think the reason we wanted to include this component of transparency in this briefing today is because it is really top of mind for so many of our clients, especially those larger clients out there who have a lot of different plan vendors, different service providers, TPAs, and others that, PBMs that maybe, working with them, that it can get a little bit complicated, especially because it looks like all the different carriers are kind of doing it a little bit differently. And so we just really kind of want to let you know that we're here for you. We're here to support you through that process. But even though it can seem a little confusing, but it's just part of what we do. I don't know, Travis, if you want to add to that a little bit of anything you're seeing on that as well. But I think for us, it's just been a little confusing because it does seem like every carrier is kind of doing it a little bit differently. And especially if you're a very large plan with lots of different service providers and vendors, it can get pretty complicated.
Yeah. And the challenging part is just kind of keeping track of everything that you just laid out and figuring as a plan sponsor, as an employer, where do we fall on that spectrum? And what does that mean? What do we have to do? And it is topical. I'll touch on that in a second, because a lot of emails are going out about data collection really just over the last couple of weeks. But where you fall on that spectrum is going to be a big piece for you. So we've been talking about some of this before. When you're fully insured, you have the easiest path ahead of you with this prescription reporting, because the insurance company is going to manage those filings. They take care of that piece. When you move into self-funding, this is where there are just more moving pieces generally on a lot of topics, but this one as well, because you've got different hands in the pot, so to speak, on prescriptions. And depending on your arrangement and your setup, this RX reporting could look a little bit different. So there's not elements of the reporting that you have to create necessarily or do all on your own, but it's going to be important to know who is taking care of what piece on your behalf. So in certain instances where you have where you're self-funded and you have an administrator, that administrator might have all of the data that they need to be able to handle this RX reporting from start to finish, and they're able to take care of it all in one fell swoop. There are other types of arrangements where you may have an administrator in place to process your medical claims, but you may also have your prescription separated, carved out with a pharmacy benefit manager or a PBM. And if they're not coordinating necessarily with each other, sharing data back and forth, you might be in a situation where you could have reporting from the pharmacy benefit manager or the administrator, or possibly even both, because prescriptions can fall under medical as well as under the pharmacy side, even when you've got them split out. So the key is not to necessarily know every single nuance of how that's going to unfold, but the key is to know who's going to take care of what part. So that's working with your consultant to make sure that you have, ideally in writing, a good handle on who's managing the RX reporting on your behalf. Because you don't want, especially on the self-funded side, to land in a situation where you're playing a little bit of catch up, because it's like, we thought that the administrator was handling this and we thought the pharmacy benefit administrator was. So most of these entities have their own processes, but they know what the legislation is. They know what the criteria is. So the piece that you want to ultimately walk away with is that you know who's filing what on your behalf, and that filing entity knows that they're handling either part or all of it. So that's a key piece that you want in writing. And the reason this has been popping up a ton is because elements of this reporting are not always captured by the administrator or even by a fully insured carrier. So we have started to see surveys go out, or brief questionnaires directly to employer groups and plan sponsors, asking for either confirmation or a couple other data points and even contact information on this particular piece so that they can handle the filing in its totality and be able to do that. So if you're starting to see or you get some of these notices, even when you're fully insured, you can get these notices because there are elements that they want to confirm who the primary contact person is, as well as some elements of what employee contributions are. So there are pieces that you will want to complete, send back in to the carrier or the administrator so that they can go ahead and handle that filing on your behalf. And that's sort of where we're filling in right now, is helping answer questions wherever there's anything that looks vague or requires a calculation that might not be straightforward. That's where you can, lean on us or your consultant to be able to answer those questions so that whoever is handling reporting can go ahead and take that process and finish it up. And we're going to assume that that's probably going to be an annual type of questionnaire. So something that's going to pop up once a year around this time as the carriers and administrators start to work on this. So it will probably be a once a year exercise, but fortunately the surveys have been small, 10 questions or less. So hopefully it's not, too much to get through.
So basically you need an RGP. Now I just made that up and that's your reporting game plan, but it sounds like there's absolutely a need for you to, as you said, where do you fit along there? Who has the responsibility? It sounds like you're collecting, as I'm sure many of our folks on the corporate synergies account management teams, our producers and everybody, collecting some really good content on how to respond, templates, surveys, what have you, so that we can continue to give the guidance that we give to our clients.
Exactly.
I thought you were referring to Chat GPT there for a second. Unfortunately,
no,
Chat GPT can't do it yet.
I'm just making up new acronyms. RGP, the reporting game plan. Stick with it. It's branded.
I'm pretty sure Chat GPT can file all this stuff for us, or they will be able to.
GPT-4, the end of the month next week. So,
so let's move to the last part here, the broker consultant service provider fee disclosures. So, Dan, again, starting with you, give us a sense of where we are. And these are good reminders. We've talked about these in the past, but give us the up-to-date, kind of overview of where we are right now today.
Yeah. So, I think this has been a big one because it's important that a lot of clients, I think, are not really realizing how important it is for them because they think of it as just a thing that brokers and consultants have to do. Right, they've got to do these annual fee disclosures under the CAA, but they're not thinking about the fact that there's also a fiduciary obligation here that's on the plan to do that could result in very big liability under ERISA. So just as some background here, what's required. So all group health plan sponsors, whether you have a fully insured plan or a self-insured plan, you have to make sure that you designate a responsible plan fiduciary. Someone who can be designated to determine that the fees that are being provided to brokers, consultants, and other service providers working on behalf of the plan are reasonable, meaning that they're only charging what's called reasonable compensation. And the way to do this, really, I think probably the main way that they do this really is by creating a fiduciary committee. The first thing you need to make sure you're doing as sort of a bare minimum is designating that responsible plan fiduciary. And that's done in the ERISA plan document. So if you don't have a plan document or your plan document hasn't designated a plan fiduciary, that's probably the first step that you need to do. And as a sort of a next step that we're seeing a lot of our clients do is put together a fiduciary committee, much like what they did about 10 years ago on the retirement plan side, when these rules came out under ERISA for the retirement plans. Is a lot of clients came up with a retirement plan fiduciary committee. Well, now is probably the best time ever to actually do that for your health and welfare plans as well, or even just combine them. And when you're making decisions on which service providers you're going to use, I should mention there is another requirement here. This covers all service providers that make $1,000 or more of direct or indirect compensation on any group health plan. So anyone who is like the broker for the medical plan or major plans that you have, brokers, consultants, other service providers that are servicing those plans, has to provide these disclosures, and you need to keep them, right, as the responsible plan fiduciary at your client. Right, you need to keep written records of what those fees are, what they're doing, right? What services they're performing for those fees. And keeping it in writing is a very important part of this as well. So, one good way to do this is by doing an RFP, right? And having a written process. But even if you don't do an RFP, as long as you have some kind of, written documentation of why you decided to choose the service providers you did, that helps you to avoid what's called a prohibited transaction under ERISA, which can be very, very significant fines and penalties in the event of an audit. So we're seeing more and more clients going this way. And I think one of the big reasons for why they're doing it is because if you look back 10 years ago, when these rules went into effect on the retirement plan side, there was a lot of litigation out there, right? There was there still is a lot of litigation on the retirement plan side when it comes to whether or not brokers are making reasonable compensation or not from the 401ks. And we think that litigation is going to go pretty soon over to the health and welfare side. And so it's really best to get yourself in order.
I'm looking at the chat, and by the way, Catherine's already using RGP. Love it. She's asking about a checklist, and it's now with all these different requirements, FAQs coming out, kind of giving everybody a sense of what potentially they could do. I kind of see that decision tree on what's the area that we're talking about. Fully insured, self-insured. What am I doing? And something that continues to evolve as more and more guidance comes out on the FAQs, and obviously as we start to see what carriers are willing to do. But I like the idea, the RGP checklist from Corporate Synergies, RGP from CSG. So perhaps that's something as a takeaway we can help put together. I'm sure that there's already in a way, all of our account management teams are doing things like that. And as this guidance just coming out a few weeks ago, but probably a good thing for us to look into. Also, some suggestions and areas here from our attendees in this conference, in this live briefing rather. Culpeper RFP runs RFP evaluations of benefit brokers, consultants for sponsors. What updated questions should we be asking brokers and consultants relative to the CAA? So that's a question that we have.
Yeah, and I think that's a great question. I think starting with this third item, which I think is very important and is often overlooked, of designating a fiduciary and making sure that making sure that the service providers are charging reasonable compensation. I think it's very, very important to obviously the most important thing is to designate a plan fiduciary, but it's very, very important thing to if you have a fiduciary meeting or fiduciary committee meeting, to keep minutes of those fiduciary committee meetings and save those. Keep those on file with your benefits documents. Meet regularly. Keep those minutes. And if you are engaging in RFPs and other more formal processes, right, before hiring and engaging the services of a plan service provider, take those things seriously, right? Take time to review them, document the process. Why did you prefer one service provider over another? And what were the services that they were agreeing to perform for that comp in relation to others? I think those types of things. I think we still unfortunately live in a world where there's a lot of like Uncle Larrys, and no offense if you have an uncle named Larry, but we
There's three Larrys on the call.
Yeah, I apologize in advance.
What choice of name? I'm only joking.
Yeah, but you see this often, right? Where you have the golfing buddy with the CEO, right? Who's getting this huge contract, and all they're telling you is there's some $500,000 consortium fee, right? You don't really know what that is. What is the consortium fee? What's being done, right? Are you getting any kind of services for that? Is there, and you're not. We still see these situations even in this sort of post CAA world that we've been living in now for almost 3 years, kind of over 2 years. We've known about these things, but we're still seeing that in our industry. And I think it's ultimately it's not just going to be on Uncle Larry and his brokerage firm or consulting firm. It's going to be on the clients as well. Particularly if what happens here on the health and welfare side is what happened on the retirement plan side.
What if that is their scenario, and unfortunately they just are not up to speed on helping their client get through all of this? What happens if they fail to comply? Where do you see this going for those that don't follow through with the guidance that we're talking about and trying to clarify for folks? I mean, how serious of an issue is that going to be?
Yeah, no, that's a good point. So now, while there was some temporary enforcement guidance that came out in a DOL field assistance bulletin, that does say that the plan fiduciaries as well as the service providers can use a good faith, reasonable interpretation of these rules for purposes of compliance. That being said, when you look at the penalties, for getting this wrong, they're very large, right? And just to be a little more specific here, right? The penalties can include fines, excise taxes, disgorgement of profits gained as a result of the what's called a prohibited transaction. And I don't want to get into all the weeds here. It's a section of ERISA called ERISA section 408B2. But if you look at violations of that, the DOL has a lot of discretion and can even assess a penalty of up to 100% of the amount that's involved in the prohibited transaction, where it's not corrected within a certain time period. So, for example, if let's say you're the CEO of a company, you're giving Uncle Larry that $500,000 a year contract for doing nothing, just being your golfing buddy, right? The penalties can be very, very significant. And also the DOL can require the employer to restore any losses incurred by the plan as a result of the prohibited transaction. So, and on top of that, right, the participants can also do a participant lawsuit for the ways that they've been harmed by the prohibited transaction. So there's a whole plaintiff's bar of ERISA attorneys out there who are just kind of salivating, looking for these types of situations and getting ready to sue. So it's really on, it's in everyone's best interest to really get those things in writing, to engage in some kind of formal process with the plan and its service providers.
A lot of work going on as it relates to all this. Travis, what's your thoughts? Is it going to help healthcare?
I mean, now that Dan's officially scared everybody with some of the repercussions of it, I think, just to kind of piggyback on some of those thoughts, definitely, know what your service providers are paid and what services are included in that. So whether you're doing a formal RFP or just to start to build the framework for where you want to move from point A to point B and documenting everything effectively, you definitely want to have a good sense of where things are right now, because that's how you determine, is it fiduciarily responsible to stay there, or do we need to make some updates to it? And, a big project that we have on the docket for 2023 is helping our clients set up the structure for that, benefits committee and making sure they understand what it is. And as Dan mentioned, you don't need to recreate the wheel. You can kind of take that 401k retirement playbook and repurpose it. And you don't, need recorded or dictated meetings. You just need the notes of who's there, data, what steps you took, what you reviewed, and what decisions you made, so that you start to, ultimately be in a spot where you feel comfortable that if you were ever audited, that you have the pieces in place that you need to avoid that. But, I think, Brian, to your question, how is all this going to impact healthcare? There's it's a slippery slope whenever you try and project forward on what's going to happen into the future. So no one can quote me on this, but I think a lot of what we're talking about revolves around transparency, right? And ultimately, in theory, transparency should result in a few things. It should result in fairer pricing, the ability to kind of benchmark where things are cost. And we're talking both from like a fee standpoint to a services, to like medical services standpoint. So fairer pricing is one piece of that. And then the other piece of it is access to data and the information that's available out there, and that access can ultimately help with decision-making processes, both on the employer side. So thinking about where you're going to structure your plan design, what type of funding arrangement you're going to use, access to more data can allow you to make a more informed decision. But it can even trickle down to really the participants, the average individual level, because if you have a better sense of what services are going to cost and you have more access to that information, you could, in theory, also be a better consumer of your benefits. And again, making more informed decisions, again, both at an employer and at an individual level. So I think the potential is there with some of the transparency that we see going on. But it's early.
Yeah, I mean, I'm putting you on the spot. I'm saying, hey, do you have a crystal ball to be able to tell us the future there in a sense? But so yeah, difficult to truly understand what happens. But I will tell you, we do have a crystal ball as it relates to knowing that there will be continued government regulations that come down the pike. There will continue to be, guidance that trickles in on those things that are regulations for everybody. And I can tell you for sure, we have a clear line of sight to the future, knowing that every time there is, we're going to have an e-alert, we're going to have a live briefing, we're going to be here to help make sure everybody is up to speed on everything that is happening. So really, thank you to our panel, and thank you to all of the attendees. As I mentioned in the chat, that we put a link there to some of the previous briefings that we've had. Always be sure to go to the Corporate Synergies website, where you will find our latest events as well as thought leadership content, whether they be articles, they be the e-alerts and what have you. And reach out to our account management teams if you have any additional questions. So with that, have a great day. Good luck with your March Madness pool, and we'll talk soon.